On Ireland's greatest robberies, we look back at some of the biggest heists to have ever taken place in this country over the last 35 years.
Nobody at the bank knew that by the end of the day this would go down in history as the most infamous bank in Belfast and would be the most audacious raid in the history of bank robberies nearly in the world. It was so well executed.
The FBI were involved, Scotland Yard were involved, Interpol were involved, the Dutch police were involved, even the Turkish Secret Service were involved.
Drop the gun!
We examine how these raids were constructed, from the precision planning through to their execution and aftermath.
Get on the ground! Get on the ground!
They carried out what is so-called tiger kidnappings. This is where you would stalk your prey like a tiger would and use your victim then to get the money out for you.
Get on your knees, hands on your what?
The gang held the family overnight. They absolutely put the fear of God into them.
Where are you taking her?
These robberies were masterminded by some of Ireland's most notorious criminals, and many remain unsolved to this very day.
Check the money, lads! Check the money!
It would have been a regular who's who of South Dublin crime at the time. The likes of Martin Cahill, Christy Dutton. They had the skill set required and they had the will to carry it out.
Tonight on Ireland's Greatest Robberies, we look at two heists in which millions of pounds in cash and valuables were stolen by ruthless criminal gangs, and how both raids baffled the Gardaí. The first robbery we examined took place in May 1983, when the well-known crime boss Martin Cahill and his accomplices raided the O'Connor's jewellery factory in Harold's Cross, stealing approximately £1.5 million worth of jewellery and gold. The second raid took place 12 years later, in January 1995, when a vicious criminal gang, who had been on the Gardaí's radar for some time, struck the Brinks Allied depot in Clonshock in North Dublin, escaping with approximately £2.8 million. By 1983, tough gangland figure Martin Cahill had committed several crimes and carried out numerous robberies. He was a man who was quickly making his way up the Gardaí's list of criminals to watch throughout the country.
Martin Cahill would have been, I suppose, a child born in the 40s. He grew up in a large family in Crumlin in South Dublin. He was one of 15 children. He would have come from quite an abuse. His father would have been quite abusive and a heavy drinker. And from a very young age, Cahill became involved in low-level petty crime. Like a lot of the youngsters in that day, they were sent down to Dangan in County Offaly, where I suppose this was essentially the cradle of crime for a lot of these criminals. They were dealt with by the monks down there and treated quite harshly, and it gave them an overwhelming hatred of authority.
To be kind to him, you could call him an eccentric. Some people would say he was a paranoid schizophrenic. He definitely wasn't well. He was mad. And he had a very dark, malevolent streak. But he was very colourful. You know, his love life was as bizarre as everything else in his existence. He shared the love of his wife and her sister, with whom he had two children. It was quite open. There was never any secret about it. Never has been any secret about it. He was an extremely vindictive individual. If somebody crossed him or he perceived you to cross him, he would come after you. And it didn't matter who you were or what you were. He would come after you, as was proved by the people he had blown up and shot. What is extraordinary in a lot of ways is that he never actually murdered anybody. But that wasn't for the want of trying. Like, he did try on a number of occasions to murder people.
In the early 1980s, the Thomas O'Connor and Sons jewellery factory was located in Harold's Cross in South Dublin. In 1983, the factory employed approximately 100 people and was the largest jewellery factory in Ireland at the time.
The O'Connor's jewellery factory in Harold's Cross had quite a large workforce, and they cut jewels and stones and gold and prepared and manufactured, put together the jewellery and valuables and diamonds and stuff for various jewellery shops around the country.
The provisional IRA They looked around always for targets where they could put big money into to replenish their coffers. And one of the targets that they had considered was a manufacturing jewellers on Harold's Cross Road called O'Connor's. They employed 100 people, employees, a major operation. But they had decided against it because of the alleged extraordinary sophisticated alarm system.
The O'Connor's Jewellers was this, I suppose, would have been the holy grail for a lot of criminals. It was this kind of this factory right in their heartland. You're talking Harold's Cross here, so close to Crumlin, Rathmines. But it also had one of the most sophisticated security systems in place. It really was state of the art at the time. But this, I suppose, only spurred on the likes of Martin Cahill, who saw these challenges, who saw these criminal, I suppose, goals as challenges and ones that he could accomplish.
In 1982, Martin Cahill had planted a bomb under the car of the state's chief forensic scientist, Dr. James Donovan. Donovan had been the principal witness in an armed robbery case against Cahill, and the bomb had left him critically injured. Cahill was now adamant that his next heist would go off without a hitch and leave no shred of evidence behind.
The breakthrough came true for Cahill when his close accomplice came to him and said that he had a man on the inside, which is, I suppose, for a lot of criminals, the key to carrying out a lot of these crimes.
The trainer himself has told me this when I interviewed him when I did the book on the General. He went to Martin and told him about his job. And Martin instantly liked it because the Duns had looked at it and couldn't do it, and particularly because of the Provisional IRA, because he thought the Provisional IRA were a bunch of muppets. And he presented this little, it was a matchbox, and he opened it, and it was full of gold shavings. And this guy had just swept them off from inside, on the benches inside in O'Connor's, and he said, this is worth a lot of money, this little box, and this is what they have lying around on the floor. Can you imagine what else is in there?
Cahill saw the potential in this, and he then went about planning the crime in meticulous detail. This is the crime where he actually earned the title the General.
Once the idea to rob O'Connor's jewellery factory was firmly planted in his head, Martin Cahill set about putting his plans in order and organising the raid down to the finest detail. This tended to be his favourite part of the robbery process.
So over the next number of months, Cahill went about organising and planning this event. He was meticulous in his detail. He would sit down, he would stare over plans. Much of the surveillance was carried out by his accomplice on the factory itself. He would have sat there and looked at it. With the aid of their inside man, they got photographs, plans of the building, and every minute detail of the raid was planned.
Himself and trainer used to sit, there's a little park across the road from O'Connor's, and he spent weeks just sitting monitoring the movements of stuff coming in and out.
You'd pass it on Harold's Cross Road, except for the big steel gate. It's absolutely unobtrusive. It doesn't look like a manufacturing jewellers, that there could be such fabulous Aladdin's cave of wealth in there, but there was. Martin had the plans. The employees, he said he knew the time of year that holidays was mostly taken. He chose a time when over more than half, three-quarters of the employees were on holidays, on their annual leave. He knew he'd have to have an army. So he recruited of the most trusted of all his people.
Cahill was determined to break into this massive jewellers, and such was the length that he was willing to go to that at one point, a couple of months before the raid itself, Cahill and his associates dug a tunnel from the Harold's Cross Greyhound Stadium, which actually backs onto the jewellers into the factory, and they'd gone some distance before a Gardaí actually discovered it and scuppered their plans. I suppose a normal person or a normal criminal might just say, well, sod this, I'll move on to the next stroke, but this only drove Cahill further and made him more determined to carry out the raid when he did.
One of the things Cahill was most particular about when planning a raid were the accomplices he chose to help him carry it out. These tended to be men who he knew he could trust the most and would stand by him if things didn't work out as planned.
He put together a team. He had a very close-knit team of people around him, and they were very loyal to him. There were up to about 15 people involved. Traynor and Martin Cahill did the actual physical planning of the job. They did the surveillance. Traynor had the information from inside. So they decided to go, and it was around July, I think, in 1983. He decided to go hit it then because the staff were at their lowest levels because a lot of people were on holidays.
Like most criminals today, and indeed throughout history, he was extremely paranoid about a leak or a so-called rat. So very often when he was carrying out his strokes, he would change the plan at the last minute. He would tell his associates he was going to one place but actually travel to another direction. This was to prevent, I suppose, the Gardaí getting wind of it.
On the night of July 5th, 1983, Martin Cahill arranged to meet his gang in a pub in South Dublin. From here, they would make their way to the O'Connor's Jewellery factory, and Cahill would finally get to see his detailed plan through.
The night before they did the robbery, they met in the Dropping Well pub in South Dublin. Martin Cahill did all this himself. Everybody had a football gear. They were meeting as a football team. Each person had a bag, and in the bag there were gloves, there was masks, they had a gun with a lanyard on it. He even thought about things like that so that you put the lanyard around your neck so you didn't drop the gun and leave it behind you during the robbery.
Martin, like every good coach, inspiring his men about the goodies they were going to get, and they were all going to be rich men. They wouldn't have to pull off any more stunts. This was going to be the makings of them. He fired them up. Martin was there drinking his sparkling orange juice, and they were having a few bevies, and he was looking around at them, and anybody would think that they were just hardshaws after having a good game of football and having a few pints, but their bags were full of gear. Each of them had revolvers. There was revolver, pistols, smoke bombs, hand grenades, handcuffs, jemmy bars, dozens and dozens of handcuffs.
It shows just the kind of planning that Cahill went into in advance of the raid, and it shows, I suppose, the level he was willing to, the level of organisation that ensured that it was, I suppose, a successful operation.
When Cahill had gathered his gang members here in the Dropping Well pub in Milltown in South Dublin, he did his final checks with them that everything was still in place for the robbery to go ahead. When Cahill was reassured, the gang, still dressed as a football team, left the pub and began making their way to the O'Connor's Jewellery factory, located in nearby Harold's Cross.
After making their way to the O'Connor's Jewellery factory located in Harold's Cross, several members of Cahill's gang hid in the boiler room at the back of the factory building, which Cahill had previously discovered wasn't alarmed. The men hid in the boiler room overnight, waiting to make their move on the factory employees who would be arriving to work the following morning.
What time is it? I have no idea. A few minutes to go, yeah, that's a few minutes to go.
The following morning, when the first of the staff arrived, the security staff, to open up to let the rest of the staff in, these guys came out, and this was a boiler house, I think, if I can recall right, which wasn't actually alarmed, and they knew this from their inside person.
When the manager arrived, they sprung on him with their weapons. He was tied up, and the remainder of the staff were also ushered into the same boiler room.
The fuck in there! Get out there! Fuck off! Get up! Get down! Fuck! Fucking knock you out! Get on the ground! Sit down! Right, no one's gonna get hurt. You swat the stuff out, you'll be gone, right?
So the boys went in, they took the security staff at gunpoint, switched off the alarm system, and they cleaned the place out.
And they were in there for about approximately 35 minutes. And over that time, they managed to steal an incredible around £2 million worth of jewels and gold bars. That, in today's terms, to give you an idea, would be worth about $4.5 million, possibly even more euro.
Martin Cahill coordinated everything on a walkie-talkie from outside. He was on a motorbike, he was cruising around watching for the cops. And then Cahill and his crew arrived in a convoy of cars. They drove in through the gates were closed, they went in and they put all the stuff into a van. When they were leaving, he actually led the convoy. There was at least one car, maybe two cars. The van was nearly down on the axles, it was such a heavy, there was about a ton of stuff on it.
Gold, silver, platinum. Thousands upon thousands of gold rings, finished and unfinished, being a manufacturing jewellers. 1,000, maybe 2,000 carats of diamonds. Thousands of carats of emeralds, of rubies, of sapphires. This was just extraordinary.
Leaving the terrified staff tied up, the van packed with £1.5 million worth of jewels and gold swiftly made its getaway from the factory.
At the parking, there's a pub there. There was one of their team waiting there, and one of them threw out, I think it was Martin, threw out about a bag with 500 grand's worth of diamonds in it to a waiting accomplice to be buried in Mount Jerome Cemetery. Why he did that, again, no one knows. Maybe he was thinking, when everything is caught, I might have these.
The van drove under escort by Martin Cahill into the early rush hour traffic around 9 o'clock in the morning, drove off, and they went to a lock-up garage at the back of a house in Sundrive Road, Crumlin. And it was a house owned by a fellow called Michael Egan. And Martin Cahill and 2 or 3 of his mates, the rest of the gang dispersed.
So they would have driven the van in and set out their total, haul.
While they were in this lockup, they were separating out the stuff. The gold had to be separated, diamonds had to be separated. You know, they were breaking them up to see what they had, you know, put them in compartments.
Each of the gold bars and the cash was all divided into neat piles where each of the members, approximately a dozen, all got their share. This took some time. It took possibly up to a day to actually sort through the loot that they had taken.
Martin Cahill was, if nothing else, absolutely egalitarian. He was fastidious about ensuring that everything was divided up. The guy with the least task or the smallest task on a job got the same amount of money as the guy going in the front door with the sawn-off shotgun. That was the way he did it. And it had to be divided up to the pound.
You know we're cool. Yeah. That's why you brought us in on the job, you know what I mean? Yeah. I'm not gonna say no.
While Martin Cahill and his accomplices sorted through their vast collection of jewellery, a major police investigation into the robbery was getting underway.
Every detective and guard in the city was pulled into the South City in the hunt for these raiders, because the enormity of this crime was just beginning to seep in to Garda headquarters. The news was coming out. There's money gone that we can't haul to dream of. Millions. It was the biggest robbery at that time in the history of the state.
Quickly, I suppose, word of the jewellery raid spread, and a number of the police were actually searching this alleyway at the time for any trace of those involved. It's claimed that at one point the police were actually trying to push in through the door where the gang were, and that the likes of Cahill and the people there had their rifles and their guns cocked, ready to open fire. So I suppose one can only imagine what it would have been, what would have happened had this raid, had the police actually gotten into the warehouse and discovered what was going on there.
Having only just escaped the Gardaí catching him, Martin Cahill knew that every shred of evidence that could possibly link him to the robbery had to be destroyed. And for the crime boss, that included all forms of transport used during the raid.
On the night following the robbery, the key then was to get rid of all the evidence that could link them to the raid. And I suppose one of the biggest treasure troves of evidence from a Garda point of view would have been the van that they used to collect the cash and the gold bars. So himself and an associate, a very well-known and notorious criminal, even to this day, drove the van to Poddle Park, where they set fire to it with petrol bombs. Now, actually, this associate of Cahill's, actually, one of the bombs exploded in his hand, and he suffered very severe injuries.
In the days following the O'Connor's raid, Martin Cahill and his gang were top of the Gardaí's list of suspects. Detective Inspector Ned Ryan, also known as the Buffalo, was the man put in charge of the Garda investigation, and a special crime squad was set up to catch the gang and anyone else suspected of being involved in the robbery. All of the suspects, apart from Martin Cahill, were arrested and questioned. This was because police believed that if they arrested Cahill, they would be giving him the public recognition that he craved for carrying out the heist.
I suppose instantly after the crime happened, Gardaí would have looked at Cahill. It was his area of operations. It was in Harold's Cross. It was quite close to where he lived. He would have carried out a number of thefts and robberies in the area. And I suppose from the previous attempt that Cahill had had to break into the factory, they knew that this was something he was interested in. Very quickly, Gardaí in the South Dublin would have had intelligence coming to them, linking Cahill to the crime. But I suppose it's one thing to have intelligence, it's another thing to have evidence. And that was what they needed in order to try and crack the case.
Well, the guards knew very quickly who was involved, because it was, Cahill was starting to make his presence very much felt at the time. One of the hallmarks of Martin Cahill's criminal career was that he always ensured he had an alibi, or he had something like, for example, he regularly turned up in Rathmines Garda station to complain about something, that he'd been stopped by guards, or they had upset him, or he wanted to show them his driving licence. And whenever that happened, it normally was a warning call to say, oh Jesus, he must be up to something again. He must be, what is he after doing now, or what's he about to do?
Upon hearing that Martin Cahill had carried out a raid on the O'Connor's jewellery factory, members of the Provisional IRA, who were believed to have attempted to rob the jewellers previously, requested to meet the crime boss and his accomplice.
The IRA actually had it reviewed and looked at the O'Connor's jewellers a number of years before, but they actually found that it was too difficult. They didn't have the inside man that Cahill had, and they didn't have the ability to carry out the jewellers. I suppose seeing Cahill rob it might have made them a bit jealous. They would have then wanted to have their share of it. They would have maybe perceived that they had an entitlement to it.
So one of the things they were doing at the time was hitting criminals for money, and especially drug dealers for money, and giving them licenses, just the way the dissident Republicans do it now today. And so it was stupid simple really for them to go and hit Martin Cahill for a portion of the proceeds of the loot from the O'Connor's jewellery robbery. And they arranged to meet in a cafe in Crumlin Shopping Centre, next door to Sundrive Road Garda Station. And they met two senior figures from the Provisional IRA.
And they put it to Martin, we want half your loot, half O'Connor's jewellers. And he said, you're not getting a penny. Fuck off and rob your own gold.
Something that's going to save it.
Forget it. Get out of my face. You're not getting any money.
That's going to turn out to be the most expensive decision you ever made.
And they walked away, but it wasn't to be forgotten.
Essentially hoping to make vast amounts of money from the O'Connor's jewellery heist, things didn't go quite as Cahill had planned in terms of selling off the millions of pounds worth of precious jewels and gold. As a result, the crime boss had to succumb to some drastic measures to offload the stolen goods overseas.
Les Beavis would have been one of the top fences. This is a gangland associate who can get rid of stolen goods, property. Obviously you can't sell them in the legitimate market, so Beavis would have been, I suppose, a go-to guy for people wanting to get rid of gold, jewels, paintings, anything like that. Beavis would have had the contacts. He would have had associates in London, in Manchester. Beavis met with the gang, and he initially offered him about £50,000 for the haul of gold bars. Cahill instantly said no. He knew that the actual value on the legitimate market was about 2 million, but he also equally knew that he wasn't going to get that from Beavis, and each of the gang was given a bag of jewels and diamonds and gold, and Beavis agreed to pay each of them between £40,000 and £50,000 for the bags.
When you're trying to cash in that much gems and diamonds and stones, you're going to only get, no matter how optimistic you are, you're only going to get a fraction of its worth from a fence. So they didn't, by current values, they didn't get as much as they had expected. It was going to be the haul that would set them all up for life, but it didn't.
While some of the gang members might have spent all their money on drink, drugs, living a high life in Dublin, Cahill was a lot more astute. He used the money to buy a massive home in Cowper Downs. This is the heart of middle class Ireland. A lovely leafy estate in Rathmines on the doorstep of the city. Now you had suddenly one of Ireland's chief gangland criminals moving in beside you. So it was quite, again, another insult to the society that Cahill so often rebelled against. It was almost two fingers to the authorities.
Martin Cahill and his fellow gang members, who had carried out the biggest heist this country had ever seen at the time, all managed to evade the authorities. However, in 1988, 5 years after the robbery took place, as a result of unusual circumstances, one conviction was made.
The only person actually convicted of a crime, convicted in relation to this crime, was Michael Egan. The breakthrough came when Egan's wife went to Jerry O'Carroll in Sundrive Road Garda Station and asked to speak to him. She made a number of allegations about her husband, and amongst these actually was the claim that Egan had supplied the workshop where the gang had counted out the bags of money.
Jerry O'Carroll, who was then a detective sergeant based in Sundrive Road, this woman went in looking for him because he was quite a famous and legendary detective who had terrorised Cahill as well and was a sworn enemy of his. But she went to him and basically said, this is what my husband was up to, and Egan admitted to it and he was convicted, but he never grassed up the boys.
I was in my office in Sundrive and she told me that they were there and the guards had come to the back gate. And then that night, as nighttime fell, all the stuff from O'Connor's, the whole haul, was weighed, measured in her house.
For Cahill, it was a game. He called it a game. And if you came down to his level, he would get really dirty with you. But if you stayed on your own level and played by your rules and he played by his rules, then that was fair. But if you changed from that, he didn't mind what he did after that,
Our next robbery takes us forward 12 years to 1995. In the early 90s, there'd been an increase in drugs flooding into the country, and cash raids, which had decreased, were now on the rise again. One such raid took place in January 1995, when a gang of criminals from various parts of North Dublin carried out a massive heist on a security van containing millions of pounds as it arrived back to the Brinks Allied depot here in Clonshock.
By the 90s, the criminal gangs knew how much money there was to be made from drugs, and the up-and-coming criminals who wanted in on the action needed to get their hands on money, and to do that they turned to armed raids. A lot of them would have got experience coming up through the ranks, kind of robbing cars and then robbing high-powered cars to order even. But when they moved into drugs, they needed serious money to get in, and that was the attraction and lure of these big hits.
Brinks was a cash and transit company that operated out of Clonshock Industrial Estate and up in Coolock there, and on the north side of the city. It was involved in carrying vast amount of money around the country from the various different banks. It was collecting cash and delivering cash to banks at the far reaches of the country. And normally these runs were escorted by both a Garda and an army escort.
Well, the gang went after the Brinks Allied depot in Clonshock because they realised that actually this was where all the cash came back to and was even better than raiding one of the vans. And they realised also how much money they were talking about. They were able to capitalise on the fact that one of the roads along the premises had been sealed off while a motorway extension was being built. So they were able to get in and out unchecked, and the fencing wasn't being monitored by any sort of an alarm, so that was of great use to them.
There was a gang operating in the north inner city at that time that had formulated from what was commonly referred to as the Bugsy Malone criminals. These were a group of young criminals who had grown up together in the north inner city. And these criminals then had progressed into armed robbers and had moved out to the suburbs of Dublin, to the North County and to the northern areas of Dublin like Coolock and Clontarf and other areas.
The gang of experienced armed robbers from various parts of Dublin had spotted an opportunity to carry out one big heist that would make them millions in cash. That opportunity was a robbery on a Brinks Allied van as it returned to the depot after collecting money from around the country. The gang knew that these vans could contain anything from £1 million up to £10 million, and so they put a major robbery plan into action.
For 8 or 9 months leading up to the robbery, the gang began putting their plans into action. One aspect of their plotting was watching the comings and goings of the Brinks depot and its staff, working out the times which the vans left and returned to the depot after collecting money from around the country.
They set about watching the movements of the Brinks vans. And one in particular van that they saw that was coming in on a regular basis at 6:30 in the evening, or just between 6 and 6:30 in the evening. And it was under Garda Army escort. And they watched the movements of the van and they watched the movements of the escort. And unfortunately, like everything else that becomes usual, people come complacent even when it comes down to security. And this was noticed by the criminals, that the Garda Army escort would escort the van back into the compound and they'd wait until the hangar door would start going up, and then the Garda Army escort would depart the compound and be gone. They would head back out and head into town. And the criminals were watching this. And they saw that there was an opportunity here to strike while the hangar door was going up and the Garda Army escort was left.
Well, in November 1994, a member of the Gardaí spotted a well-known north side Dublin criminal monitoring a security van that was picking up cash at the north side shopping centre. He became suspicious, and it was decided that members of the ERU would monitor this gangster and some of his cronies and see what was going on. And there were very serious suspicions that a major heist was about to take place. An operation was launched called Operation Liffey, and it involved members of the ERU, the Emergency Response Unit, and the Serious Crime Squad. And for about 2 months they monitored the gang, and they established that something was definitely in the offing. But unfortunately, due to resources and the fact that it was taking so long, they considered it probable that the plan had been put off, and they just did not have the resources to sustain the operation, and so they backed off.
Once they knew how the Brinks depot ran their business on a day-to-day basis, the gang began putting their plans for the raid into action. This involved stealing jeeps for use during the raid, digging trenches leading to the depot, and breaking down fences to make access to the depot as easy as possible.
They had to get logistics for it. In other words, they had to get the proper firearms that they required They had to get vehicles, that were capable of driving across rough terrain. So they actually set out about a plan in advance. They then saw, that they would have to travel across terrain, a number of fields at the back of the Brinks Allied, and they set about setting up a pathway through the fields. So they cut their way through two ditches, one a ditch from a road and that led into a field, and they crossed that field, cut another trench through a ditch so that they could drive into the field that directly behind Brinks Allied. But then at the rear of Brinks Allied, the fence, there was a ditch. So to traverse the ditch, they used railway sleepers, and they covered them with moss and painted them green so that they would blend in with the surrounding countryside. They also cut the palisade fencing so that it was weakened at that area, so that they could, when they arrive at the correct time, all they would have to do is ram the palisade fencing, and they would be straight into the rear yard of Brinks.
On January 17, 1995, a criminal intelligence document was circulated among Garda stations on the north side of the city, stating that according to information from informants, a group of 12 individuals was planning on carrying out a major heist. The Gardaí didn't know the specifics of where or when the gang would hit, but they did know who to watch, and they had an idea that it would be a security van or a depot. However, on the 24th of January 1995, unknown to the Gardaí, this gang were ready to hit their target.
On January 24th, 1995, a van left Brinks Allied and it went to AIB in Balls Bridge, where it met its Garda and Army escort. Under law, that had to be the case as a result of a previous robbery. And it went around the southeast collecting around almost 3 million in used notes. By 6:25 it was back in Clonshock. It drove into the premises and around to the back of the building, and it pulled into Bay 3. Once the van arrived in, the Garda and Army escort presumed they were safe and left. And at this point, the raiders struck.
The hangar started going up. The van went in. Staff inside then started unloading the van, which was the normal practice. And as the hangar was coming down, the raiders rammed the balustrade fencing at the rear of the compound, drove straight over and lodged the 4x4 underneath the hangar gate as it was coming down, thus preventing it from closing.
When the gang members jumped out of that jeep, 6 of them dressed in dark clothes with balaclavas, it was absolutely terrifying. They were all volatile, they were all violent, they had guns, they were firing their guns, they were aggressive, they were shouting that they were going to blow people's heads off, they were demanding money, they were off their heads. The staff were absolutely terrified, and the gang tied them up, and you can imagine the sense of panic and fear.
Check the money! Yeah! Come on! Let's go! Get the box!
And these raiders then started loading bags of cash that had been collected from the various banks throughout the country. And they started loading that into another 4x4, which had reversed into the compound. And they loaded something in the region of 75 bags of cash. And the raiders then hopped into this other 4x4 and they sped across the fields and out into the back of the airport and disappeared into the night.
In the days following the Brinks Allied heist, an intensive investigation was carried out, but no clues surfaced as to the whereabouts of the stolen cash. Chaos also erupted in government circles for a major crackdown on the big criminals to be enforced. There was also huge embarrassment when the Garda intelligence document from January 17th, which highlighted the possibility of a robbery being organised by a criminal gang, was published.
They had taken somewhere in the region of £3 million in cash. And this was a daring raid, for want of a better way of explaining or calling it. But this was a raid that the police in this country had never experienced before. Obviously, this raised an awful lot of questions in the Dáil and everywhere else.
Well, following the heist, Gardaí focused on a well-known Dublin gang, the gang that they had been monitoring from the start, but unfortunately the gang had been so thorough and their operation was so successful that there was no evidence, there was no forensics to link them back to the crime, and the money was never recovered.
So all the detectives on the north side of the city obviously were involved in the investigation into this major crime. Special operations were set up around the country to prevent these vans and criminals from escaping with this cash.
There was a lot of recrimination following the raid because of the fact that this Garda document had done the rounds, and Gardaí really did seem to be on top of the information. It should have been prevented, but the cash wasn't recovered, and nobody in the criminal underworld was doing any more talking. Probably whoever had been talking was too terrified because of the fact that Gangland now knew that somebody had been informing on them. And so it actually fell to Veronica Guerin, who started writing about the story, to start things up again.
During the investigation, Gardaí began to focus their attention on Dublin criminal Jerry Hutch, otherwise known as the Monk. Crime journalist Veronica Guerin had also written several articles in the Sunday Independent newspaper claiming that Hutch was responsible for the Brinks Allied heist.
Well, Garda intelligence was clearly operating on information, and they knew Jerry Hutch, also known as the Monk, was the main suspect, and they monitored him quite closely, but he was extremely careful, and they were never able to forensically link him to the crime.
Other members of the gang were arrested. They would have been considered to be periphery criminals who were involved in the crime itself. Immediately in the aftermath of the robbery, the vehicles were, as I recall, some of them were dumped in Spencer Dock and recovered months afterwards. So any evidence that would have been available, from a forensic point of view, was destroyed.
Although over a decade apart, the raid on the O'Connor's jewellery factory in 1983 and the robbery of the Brinks Allied depot in 1995 had similar outcomes in that none of the haul from either heist was ever recovered. Both robberies had managed to baffle the Gardaí, and the lack of evidence made it extremely difficult to get convictions for either heist. Both raids were meticulously planned and orchestrated by the criminal gangs involved, and to this day still remain two of the greatest robberies this country has ever seen.